Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. On this episode, Kristina Rogers, Global Consumer Industries Leader Retail for EY, is back on the podcast with an update from their Future Consumer Index, looking at the quasi-post-COVID, inflation-battered but more resilient and agile customer retailers face for the back half of 22 and beyond.
Well, you're right. So thank you for paying attention. We have seen change. So, there was I would say a few cycles of research ago where I think, and we might have discussed this back in November even, where, people had been at home and they realized how much stuff they had. They realized how much stuff they had that they didn't need. And being at home, they also realized how much waste they created because, that waste was not distributed at the office, at the gym, at school, right in the coffee shop or what have you. It was just, whole families were filling up their garbage bins, daily.
Let's listen in now. Kristina, welcome back to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. Great. Hi, Michael. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. Always a good chat.
Yeah. Well, it's great to hear your voice. You and I first met in Vancouver in person, I think. And then over the COVID year, I've been so fascinated by tracking your study and the work you do because it has just been, it helps me and I think helps the retailers and everyone listening understand how consumers' behaviors are fundamentally changing.
Well, thank you. That's a great compliment. And yes, we did meet in Vancouver, but I lose track of when that was. I think we all have the pandemic timeline brain that we've lost a couple years. So maybe that was 3 years ago. I'm not sure, but
it's so funny you say that. I think it was 2019. It could have even been 2018. It could have even been 2018, but I think it was 2019. And then the time just 2 years, it just disappears. Like we stepped into some kind of time tunnel, right?
Absolutely.
It's just crazy. All right. Well, listen, you've been on the podcast a couple of times before. I had the pleasure of chitting and chatting, but briefly, for those who may not have heard those first couple of interviews, tell us about yourself and who you work for and what you do.
Well, thank you, Michael. Kristina Rogers, Global Consumer Leader at EY. And, that's a role. So this role covers consumer products, retail, and food and agribusiness. And my primary responsibility is to set the global strategy for EY in these sectors. So thinking ahead to next and beyond on behalf of our clients. And then thinking through what does that mean for our approach as EY, capabilities, solutions, investments in technology, and anything else we might need to bring together in these sectors for EY to win and for our clients to win as we partner with them.
Now
go ahead.
You and I have talked about the tradecraft of how you do your job, but I don't think I've asked you like kind of structural issues. Like, do you have a team? At what level do you take this knowledge and then impart it to your counterparts or impart it to their clients? Like, talk for a few minutes about how you create content. That's what we're going to talk about in the content. But then how you, let's say, distribute it or disseminate it, or actually make it valuable to both your partners and the clients around the world.
Sure. Well, I definitely have a team, and I guess what was a good news for us as a team, good and bad, it's a very globally distributed team. So the way in working that kind of hit a lot of people, as the pandemic came on, was exactly the way the global team was working. Over time zones, at home, phone calls. We didn't do as much video. There's a global team that works on this, and we have teams in markets. So we have sector teams in markets, people who are responsible for driving the agenda and driving the strategy in our priority areas and markets. And then we work very closely, with our account teams, ensuring that we understand the agenda of our clients, making sure that we're on the right track, making sure that we're even one step ahead so that we can bring ideas, content, solutions, ideas for partnering to our account teams and into our clients.
Last time we spoke was November 2021, and I guess we were just talking about the time tunnel of COVID. It's kind of like dog years or cannabis years. They all seem to move pretty quickly. Just before we get into dive into the EY Future Consumer Index latest results, talk about your thinking around what big three things have kind of changed, if any? And you and I have talked about this, the difference between the short-term accommodations versus structural. But as you and your team members and the partners around the world are thinking, what should retailers really be thinking about that has changed fundamentally, if anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there has been a lot of change even since we last spoke. And that was probably a nice inflection point because we were kind of coming out of things then, right? And so we were having different sorts of conversations with our clients, that's for sure, in terms of preparing to either a new normal or back to normal. I would say one thing that, we've been talking a lot about is really the post-pandemic shopping behavior. So what has stuck and what hasn't. And what I mean by this is I think there are categories in inventory, that are now on a past purchase list, right? Something that consumers just automatically replenish. They don't want a physical shopping experience around it. They have little need to, quote, shop that category in a traditional way or spend time learning much about it. And so you could imagine that half the grocery list now, right, is on past purchase in e-commerce, auto
Would
replenishment.
You call that, is another way of saying that replenishment? It's kind of just, I just want to replenish.
Yeah. And I also don't want to engage. Right. So I think it's not just it's the convenient replenishment. It's just like these are categories that they're kind of set. I don't need to know about new brands necessarily. I'm not going to be that interested to go out and look for new and improved. I just, I don't care. I'm just, buying those things.
That's
right?
trouble.
So,
Isn't that sounds like good news, bad news. The good news for those that have been chosen, the bad news for incumbents. No?
Yeah, I think so too. So I think we've got to do a lot more of unpacking of that behavior and what it means. So, and we have done some analysis on what's landing on the quote, I just want to buy it, right? I don't care that much about it. I don't want to engage. And I'll put it on past purchase and auto replenishment if I can, right? And then, there's other categories which people are still much more emotional about. They're inclined to shop. And by shop, I mean they want to engage with the product or category. They want to understand and experience it. They're eager to learn more about it. They will keep tabs on maybe what's coming up as new.
Open to new ideas.
Yeah.
Open to new
that,
suggestions. Right? Yeah, right.
Online or in store, wherever it may be, they're just engaged with it. So, we're starting to see that sort of sort itself out. And especially for, physical retail, I think really forensically assessing, right, the inventory mix of what is shopped and what's more mindlessly bought and maybe just on autopilot, I think will be critical, as you think about assortment or what you do with things either in store or on your digital channels.
One of the things I've been thinking about is how consumers basically bought forward 18 months of goods, and now there's just less demand. But that felt like, I think you and I even talked about this. Eventually, this party's going to stop, right? Eventually, people are going to go back to in whatever quasi-post-COVID era we're in. They're going to travel again and go on vacations and buy, do services, and so they kind of drew forward a bunch of sales. And does that mix up the data a little bit? In other words, nobody's buying a certain, washing machine sales are collapsing. Yeah, because everybody bought one. So it doesn't really tell us anything about behaviors. It tells us more about this weird buy forward period.
Sort of buying forward or pantry stuffing or that sort of thing. Well, I think, we've been looking at more the fast moving consumer goods, so less your hard durables like that. But I think it's more around, you're right, there might be some pantry stuffing and that sort of thing. But I do think some of that, and of course, because of inflation, some of that returned. Sure. Because people weren't sure what things would cost next month, right? That was kind of a really steep and rapid acceleration of prices for a while there. But I think we've been looking at the data long enough, and we had hypotheses around this even before the acceleration of online shopping, especially the online grocery shopping in North America. And so we've kind of been just monitoring the hypotheses and how we'd been thinking about it and seeing what happened through the pandemic and where it's coming out now. And I think there are some clear patterns of types of categories that people just have less interest in engaging with.
So interesting. All right. Well, let's talk about the Future Consumer Index. Again, for those who may not have heard earlier, just describe the index, its scope, and its objectives so they know what we're talking about in terms of this research.
So this research was launched at the end of April in 2020, and it was launched globally in 15 countries to put a stake in the ground really as to what was happening to us as people and as consumers as all of the global hard lockdowns began. because, I'm a person, I'm a consumer, and it was clear that something was happening, right? So to us, our family, our household. And so we quickly wanted to get something out there that we would be able to track people's changing behaviors, sentiments, what was happening. And we didn't know how long we'd be doing that for, clearly at the very beginning, but we certainly wanted to be doing our best to understand the changes that were about to become upon us. So since then, we've launched 10 rounds of research tracking consumer sentiment throughout the pandemic and then post-pandemic to really understand, as I said, what sort of behaviors did we adopt that are sticking around, or what things we've dropped now that we're kind of getting back to normal. But, what has really changed? So, we're trying to really understand some of these changes, both in our behaviors, our sentiments, our expectations, that, in terms of where we are, 2.5 years later. And so the latest research took place in early June this year and covers 18,000 respondents from 24 countries. We've managed to up the number of,
right?
Yep, in Canada, absolutely. Yep. And it, trying to get a real 360-degree perspective on just how we're changing, and what we're thinking about the future, if that's possible.
Since we last spoke, since probably the last iteration of the survey, a couple of things have happened. War in Europe, first of all.
Yep.
We're in some kind of quasi-post-COVID. It's still around, might come back, but it still has some impact. And then you've got inflation, which for many consumers and in fact many retailers, there's a generation of us that haven't really dealt. What's the playbook for a high inflationary environment? We don't really know. So are those some of the things that could have influenced how folks have responded? And what are the kind of top things you learned out of this round of the research?
Well, we absolutely asked about the war because it had been going on for a few months by the time we were in field. And inflation, I think we'd had a couple months. It peaked, I guess, about a month later. But so we did, certainly, we asked about those things. And you see, of course, differences, right? Globally, in Europe, the war is much more prominent in terms of people's minds. But, one thing that I just even looking across the data, so we've got all these things. We thought the pandemic would be over and we'd go back to kind of late 2019. But I think, clearly we ended up with inflation, the war, and other things happening, this year that weren't expected. And so, having looked at our data and data elsewhere and even speaking to clients, I think one thing that sticks out is that for retailers, consumers now, we can't be counted on, right? We used to have predictable routines around shopping and consumption. We used to stick to our beloved brands, and we maybe thought private label or store brands were only for low-income families. And I think we've just kind of gotten used to needing to be ready for change, and we have changed. And so I think, retailers really need to be thinking through that. What does that mean? We now accept almost that we don't have a comfort zone. And we need to be ready for something new to be thrown upon us. And I think that affects the way retailers, need to think about consumers. Retailers used to count on predictable seasons, predictable ways of shopping, adherence to premium brands, and so on. But I think we're seeing, no, consumers are comfortable with changing things up, comfortable with changing patterns, comfortable with changing products, brands, for whatever reason they might need to, because they've been on edge and in a cycle like that now for almost 3 years. And so, we're seeing a lot more consumers kind of ready for change.
Interesting. Were you, one of those changes I can think about, the kind of, the shockwave of demand and then the sledgehammer of slowness is e-commerce. I think for some retailers and some observers, a deceleration of e-commerce and a return to stores took them by surprise. Did you see any of the data, and were you surprised with how fast e-commerce flatlined?
I guess I'll refer to what I said earlier, or just a few minutes ago, about some categories, have become those to be shopped and others to be simply bought. So I think those things that people truly wanted to be out physically and shopping for, where they wanted an experience, they wanted to linger, they wanted to gather information, wanted to compare and contrast. In that case, I'm not surprised because I think there was probably pent up demand for having those experiences for things they emotionally cared about or categories they wanted to be part of.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm surprised. I suppose I'm surprised by who is in the store. And this is completely now anecdotal, Michael, so I'm off of our research per se, but I can say my household's aligns with it. I mean, it seems to be younger people. And so, I don't know if that's something to do and maybe a welcome relief from digital life.
Yeah.
But
that's my theory. Youth were getting off their phones and going shopping in shopping malls together to get away from the oppressive social media.
Absolutely. I can see that amongst my children and their friends. So, but I also wonder, Michael, if it's an escape from sort of the higher and higher delivery charges, right, for hyper fast delivery. I mean, hyper fast and free is actually going to the store. Right. So,
right.
I think we can think of at least in the United States, a particular grocery retailer that used to have free delivery during the pandemic, but now it's $10. So, there's some of that going on. I can see from our FCI data, or I could infer that, while some segments of consumers, right, were forced into e-commerce during the pandemic and maybe they hadn't used it before, and maybe they were suspicious of it anyway, regardless of the convenience, we can still see in the data that there are, large chunks of the population globally that are concerned about ID theft and fraud, right? They're concerned about apps tracking their movements. They're concerned about sharing personal information. And so it wouldn't surprise me that there's a good chunk of those people who said, thank goodness this is all over. I can get back into the stores, right? So there's probably a number of things going on. And even for those people that, are just suspicious still of shopping online, there's still the cost of delivery, which many people are having an allergic reaction to. And then, more often than not, there's the not sustainable packaging part of online shopping that I do think in some parts of the world, and I'm hopeful more and more here, we try to address and sort out.
That's a great segue into my next question, which was, when I looked at the headlines of the report, when I first kind of opened that email and looked at the report, it was a little depressing because it felt like consumers were doing this old habit of returning to the mean. That I think the lead was, price is taking over from sustainability issues. But then on further reading, as I delved into the report, it's a little more nuanced than that, right? How do you interpret what consumers are doing? It used to be the case that when the economy got more difficult, the concerns or interest in buying or forwarding or focus on sustainability or any of those practices went down. Have you seen any fundamental change? I see some change in your data, but talk about what you see in terms of how consumers are thinking around sustainability, ESG issues, and the like.
Well, you're right. So thank you for paying attention. We have seen change. So, there was I would say a few cycles of research ago where I think, and we might have discussed this back in November even, where, people had been at home and they realized how much stuff they had. They realized how much stuff they had that they didn't need. And being at home, they also realized how much waste they created because, that waste was not distributed at the office, at the gym, at school, right in the coffee shop or what have you. It was just, whole families were filling up their garbage bins, daily. So there was, we certainly saw more interest and more desire for to participate in buying things that were more sustainably sourced or had more sustainable packaging. But we definitely, to your point about a little depressing, we've seen, because of, I think, inflation, and we see that in the data, people find, they're just concerned about, their budgets. And they do find that it's expensive to buy environmentally sustainable products. I think something around 70% of those that we, research say that really higher prices have deterred them from buying those kind of products. But you do have mixed income levels, in that data.
Sure. Yeah.
But to your point about the nuance, there's some interesting things there. We have seen people looking to reduce and reuse. And so, some 70 9 or 80% of those we talk to, regularly try to recycle or repurpose products. And many of them are also saying that they are really trying to make an effort to reduce food waste, which is also, of course, a big problem. And with price increases and inflation, you would want to be doing that anyway, but it has a nice effect of, creating a habit that we need to create in any case.
What do you think of what's going on in Europe? Because it's resonating here in Canada. The discussion, it's been a long time discussion in the FMCC, the fast moving consumer goods, around best before dates. So in Europe, there's some walking away from best before dates, precisely as you say, because it creates more food waste. Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, my partner on the Food Professor, and Dal just did the research that Canadians said, no, I still like them. And I still want best before dates. And nested within all that is this idea of less food waste, because if prices are going up, maybe the impetus there is, just buy what you need as opposed to, buy extra. And maybe that helps balance things out. Maybe in the long run, that's not such a terrible thing either, right?
Yep. I think, I would agree with the Europeans if I had to put my personal stamp on that. Best before dates, fine, but most things are good well beyond the best before date. And, if you do what your grandparents told you to do, smell, taste a little bit, you'll probably know if something's really not best anymore. But yeah, I think we've been really trained, certainly in North America, and maybe even more so here where I am in Chicago and in the U.S., to be led that things are expired rather than best before. And so I do think, some of these regulations and some of the things that are out there around food waste, we do need to have a good look at, because especially I think younger generations are really trained to pay attention to that and to believe that means expired.
So maybe it's funny, right? Because on the one hand, the consumers are getting, I think, again, even looking at most of the recent data, they're more savvy, they're more agile, they're doing a bunch of things. It's a funny choice of words, because best before doesn't mean deadly after, right? That's the kind of joke we have amongst ourselves. Like the next day, everything's still fine.
Maybe that should be, we should be replacing best before with deadly after. I like it. I mean, I do think the interesting thing about we see broadly with consumers, Michael, is that they do expect, despite a lot of what they say, right, around, I'll participate, I want to do my part, but they want it to be very easy. So, consumers are not that interested writ large. I mean, there's obviously pockets and segments, but they're not, they don't want to go looking for a lot of data. They don't want to go, spending time on things. They want brands and retailers to, help and to provide the information. And, we even see that in our data where you've got almost 3/4 of respondents feel passionately that companies should drive positive and social environmental outcomes. It's unclear where they feel their own responsibility is. And you certainly see very strongly that consumers expect brands and retailers to provide information and the information that they need to make choices.
I guess there's risk and opportunity in that, right? Because if you're on the positive side and you're doing the opportunity, you're taking those initiatives that answer the questions. And I interviewed Michael Medline and Mohit Grover from Sobeys, and they've got a comprehensive sustainability, and they're doing, serious, they were one of the first, for example, to eliminate plastic bags, and like one step, they got rid of 14 million plastic bags. And I think for them, it's nested in their strategy, both morals, but ethics, but also practically. One of the other things I love about your research is you don't just put a bunch of research out there, you draw from it some insights or conclusions for the brands or for the retailers. So out of this, you came up with 4 imperatives. Talk about those.
There's a few things I'll say. If you don't mind me, a little plug first, Michael.
Plug away.
I would say, all of the work we're doing, plus looking at this research, I would say, retailers really need to think about striving to create intimacy, invisibility, and indispensability. And I say a little plug because at EY we call that the 3 I's of retail. And what I mean by that— What
were they again? Say those again.
Intimacy.
Yeah.
Invisibility.
Yeah.
And indispensability.
All right. Okay. The 3 I's.
And the 3 I's of retail. And what I mean by that is, it takes great data insights to truly know me, right, and what I want. It takes a lot of tech and operational efficiency for you to be invisible to me. And it takes relevant assortment, services, and logistics in the spirit of right thing, right time, right place for you to be indispensable to me. And that's a lot of work and investment for a retailer. But
say more about invisible. Unpack
invisible.
That a little for me.
So friction, rather than go down the frictionless route, Michael. So, it's invisible. I would like to use your services. I would like to buy from you. I would like to have delivery from you. I'd like to be in store from you, but I don't want any friction about it. I want it to be invisible in my life. I want it to be easy. I want to take any challenges or problems out of bringing the physical and the digital together. So invisible in that sense, which is why I'm saying, it's a lot of tech and operational efficiency to get that right. But, I think this is the way we've been talking to some of our retail clients, and they get it. They understand what those pillars are and how they could create really lasting loyalty from a consumer if you figure it all out.
Interesting. Isaac Asimov once said that great technology should be like magic. It just should happen. And
that's exactly right.
Right? I mean, if you transport yourself back to our parents' generation where you just pick up the phone and it works. If you go back 2 generations, it wasn't always so. And now you just expect it to happen, right? So that kind of magic that we can all make together. Okay, so what were some of those other imperatives that your research told you this time around?
Yeah, and so we part of it gets back to that sustainability that we were talking about. So really setting the company KPIs to really reflect the changing consumer values, and often that is around sustainability and what they want. And I think we really need to work hard. We're working hard with our clients to help them think about what those new KPIs are, and what does that mean for the organization, and retailers really need to work hard with brands and suppliers on, figuring out how to deliver, because retailers are often, in between the brands and the consumers. But consumers do expect retailers to provide a significant amount of effort and information about products, packaging, and the direction they're taking around these things that consumers value. So we're doing some work at the board level around just thinking about, KPIs in this direction that really link to what the consumer, is emotionally wanting.
It's interesting that the phrase you used. I found that interesting. That the retailers are between the brands and the consumers. Like there's a great exploration or debate around the role of direct selling and the role of retailers. In some ways, the role of the no value added middleman in the middle of that is clearly the time is over. But at the same time, we see many direct brands starting to do traditional wholesale deals like Casper, for example, which has gone private, and Ali, a lot of these startups that were pure play. It's like taking the D out of DTC, as my friend Simon Siegel says. Like, when you sit down with brands, for a while it felt like there was a big impetus. Say, you know what, you don't need the retailers, just start selling direct. And I'm not sure. I'm sure in your meetings there was the great appreciation, but there's a lot of costs involved in that. And I'm not sure all consumers want to deal with 100 different brands. They just want to go to a grocery store. What do you think of all that? What do you make of all this stuff?
Yeah, well, I think that does get back to really, if I would think about, what retailers need to be thinking through, whether they started off as D2C or whether they started off just a physical and now they've moved into a digital space plus a physical, or what have you. I think it's one of your friends and the colleagues you work with, Michael, seem to have a lot of good phraseology because I think it's one of your colleagues who says the consumer is the channel now. Yeah, and right. I think that's right. True. And I think that's, these organizations need to really embrace that because it's the consumer that should be dictating how the business evolves, where they want to be, how they want to experience brands, what sort of assortment what they're looking for. I mean, and I think we've probably touched on this in a previous podcast where, really viscerally understanding where the consumer is going and what it is that they want and it used to be that it was one-way traffic, right? The brand or the manufacturer developed a product that they expected we wanted. The retailer put it on the shelf, and then we went and bought it. Right?
Most of it failed, actually, by the numbers, right? I mean, the numbers around new product launches.
Yep.
Most fail, right? You're better off.
But now it's going in the other direction, Michael, right? It's from the consumer back into through the retailer, maybe not, but through back into the brands and the manufacturers. So it's a completely different model and direction of, development or strategy or what have you. And we've talked a lot about that in our ag and food business, where we've talked to, it used to be farm to fork, right? Now it's fork back to farm. Consumers are saying what they want.
Yeah.
And they won't buy, products, brands that aren't what they want.
Yeah, that's a whole other exploration. That's fascinating stuff. All right, so great exploration, and I'll put a link into the show notes to so folks can go look at the research themselves and see the graphs and all that great stuff. What's next? I mean, looking ahead the next 6 to 12 months for you and how you're thinking about the continuing evolution. Will there be another iteration of the study? You said we're not sure how long this thing is going to run. Are you going to keep it going? Are you going to keep the future index going through the future?
We are. We're certainly making some amendments and adapting it, away from, health and COVID and those related types of, parts of the research that goes out.
Yes,
and
please.
Let's move on. But what we're trying to do now is we have a body, there's parts of that research, and it's created a nice longitudinal set of data in different countries, which we can explore. And we're starting to just build on some of that. So we're starting, to think more about, can we research people's expectations around digital life? What does that actually mean to people of different, generations and age groups?
Are you talking about the metaverse there? Are you thinking about?
I mean, I'm not. I mean, we're not going to explore the metaverse, in a crazy big way, because there's, it's in certain places right now, and people are exploring it, and it was certainly much more, I would say, in our lives, and at least my work life earlier in the year. And then we had the war and and inflation and so on. It's kind of died down a little bit, but we know it's there in the background, and we want to, start getting a pulse of, who's where with that. And, maybe start just trying to understand some digital financial life. How are people really feeling about, cryptocurrencies? And so we're just getting our arms around that, Michael, to really buttress, the longitudinal content and data we have, to see, where can we explore next? Because we want to certainly be moving away from pandemic and hopefully, off inflation next year.
Well, as a quick side note, you talked about digital currency. It was, I think, interesting. I wonder if you heard some of this back in the summer here in Canada. One of the big providers, Rogers, both mobile and all telephony went out, gone.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So, but what I thought was interesting about it was how cash became king for a couple of days. And a lot of retailers said, hey, if we go all digital, we're out of business. And then sure enough, 2 weeks ago, all downtown Toronto's power got cut off by some boat in the harbor. And once again, cash was king. So it's just you don't know what's coming around.
So I'm actually someone who is planning for technology. I've got cash in my wallet, Michael. So I'm still one of those people.
Yeah, me too, man. I don't have it in the mattress, but I have more now since the summer than I used to carry around. Well, listen, as always, great insights, great conversation. Love what you bring to the market. And if people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, are you a LinkedIn person? What's the best way to do that?
Yep, I'm a LinkedIn person. I'm there. I tend to you'll find more of the content from our work there that I put there, and blogs that I kind of do occasionally, where I've been looking at our data and thinking, oh, that's an interesting angle to it. So yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, listen, continued success, continued safe travelings when you do, or existing in the universe or metaverse when you do that too. So listen, thanks again for joining me.
Yeah,
on the Voice
I'm not going to be in the metaverse anytime soon, Michael. I have been there, and I wasn't that convinced yet. So
been there, done that, got the
T-shirt.
Been
there. I guess I'll return later. Maybe Metaverse 2.0.
Maybe.
All right.
Maybe. Anyway, thanks again for joining me, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next podcast, and the Food Professor podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of Emmy LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at emmyleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.